Okay, today I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and I'm going to say that this year, 2025, data privacy is under attack, and it's posing a threat to democracy and each of our individual freedoms. What we're witnessing today, especially south of the border, is this rise of illiberalism. This is a cardinal dereliction of our laws that guarantees the freedom of our rights, especially for those of all of us who live in democratic societies. The current administration has moved to deregulate big tech and shift priorities away from more stricter oversight. This will give artificial intelligence the fuel to proliferate this threat to our data privacy. Welcome to Tech Uncensored. Hi, everyone. My name is Hessie Jones. I'm going to give you a short history on how fast AI has actually emerged in the last decade. In 2012, deep learning networks dramatically improved their performance in tasks like image, speech recognition, and AI quickly integrated into much of the software and services that we see today. By 2016, the market for AI-related products had grown to over $20 billion in North America alone. And for that time, that was a huge number. So we started seeing this AI frenzy become a lot more prevalent across our industry. By the next year, 2017, there was a pivotal development in AI because of breakthroughs within deep learning, as well as the introduction of transformer architecture. And this enabled systems to start to process and generate language with unprecedented fluency and scale. In fact, a lot of these transformers became the foundation for large language models. And as we see today, they can power applications that could read, that could write, that could translate, that could summarize, and can even create art. But as they grew and as they became a lot more powerful, their appetite for data intensified. A lot of what we see in AI today relies on these vast data sets, and oftentimes they will collect personal information to train as well as refine their algorithms. And this brings up the whole notion of privacy. Privacy has been there for many years, especially with the rise of digital. Data privacy has become a lot more pronounced. And AI has this ability to collect, analyze, infer massive amounts of information based on personal data. And this has given rise to more infractions that are more severe and much more pervasive than we expected. We're starting to see automated decision-making systems that can profile individuals many times without their knowledge or consent. It leads to surveillance, and you can even create dossiers today through Perplexity. It's much better than, I would say, even a Google search. Generative AI poses more threats. These systems can be used to create fake profiles, manipulate images, synthesize convincing but false content, and even amplify the risk for identity theft and misinformation. What's happening in the US today has fundamentally lowered the protections for US citizens. This administration seeks to deregulate a lot of what big tech regulations have been there before in favor of less access restrictions to data. So they want to prioritize this global AI race over robust ethical and privacy protections, which the Biden administration had put together. So all of this to say, I'm pleased to welcome Abigail Dubinieski to the stage. She is a privacy lawyer. She's a strategist. She's a thought leader. She's a friend of mine, and she works at the intersection of data privacy, AI, politics, and law. And so we're going to talk all about the implications of what's happening in the US, the spillover effects on Canada and globally. What should we expect in the coming years should the current administration actually continue down this path? And For companies that have more robust privacy regimes, what are they doing to try to combat this? And more importantly, for the big tech companies like Amazon, Meta, OpenAI, which have successfully created broad adoption for their services, what does it mean to the users of their platforms? There's so much to tackle. So I'm pleased to welcome Abigail. Thank you so much for coming to talk with me today and discuss a lot of these issues.
My pleasure.
All right. So let's get into the first one, because you are a privacy lawyer, so you can talk all about some of the legislations that have been repealed as a result of the new Trump administration. So Biden, I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he had the Biden AI executive order. And the idea was to ensure safe and secure, trustworthy development of AI. But it limited the sector's ability to innovate. That's what Trump had said. I want to give you a quote from the ACLU that justified why Trump actually repealed this executive order. And they said, President Trump's goal is clear: to undo anything that could do away with the breakneck AI development and deployment. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Biden AI executive order, and now what does it mean to companies, to individuals, now that it's been repealed?
Okay. So first of all, I'm not a US lawyer, I'm a Canadian lawyer, but I've done my research and I understand how executive orders work. So I just want to start by explaining that first, because the way the American Constitution is set up, the president, although he behaves like a king and the Supreme Court's allowed him to be, it's not the president that makes laws, right? So, but what the president, it's Congress that makes laws, right? But what the president can do is issue executive orders, which are binding, they're effectively binding directives on the executive branch, the departments, the agencies, like you think NIST, you think FTC, Immigration, Homeland Security, all of these things, those are agencies and they must fall in line with the executive order. So what Biden did was he issued a very sweeping executive order on AI that required most agencies, they fall into a certain class to have a chief AI officer. They had procurement requirements. They had to maintain an AI inventory. There were certain things they had to demand of vendors who were trying to sell them AI products. Their NIST had orders to do certain things, so they had to come up with something for generative AI along the lines of their AI risk management framework. There's the National Science Foundation, the NSF, had a ton of stuff that they were supposed to do. And it also gave an opportunity to create these labs where organizations could actually get computing power and do stuff. So it was very much of the flavor of what the EU has been doing, right? So the EU, but he had to use a different mechanism. So the EU went through the long and extremely grinding and painful process of creating the EU AI Act. And as part of their broader digital strategy, they have a bunch of other laws, many of which impact AI, such as the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that I live in, as well as the Digital Services Act and many others. So Biden couldn't do that because this was the least productive Congress, I think, in history. There was a lot of obstruction, not a lot of lawmaking that was happening. And so the drawback to doing something by executive order is that it can be repealed by another executive, and that's exactly what happened. Now, some people were upset. Many in the responsible AI, the trustworthy AI community were very upset because they felt that it did strike a really good balance. It put in a number of important guardrails. Certain things like your vendor couldn't just tell you that the product does X, Y, and Z. They would actually have to show you. They would have to actually be able to demonstrate where they got that data, which is obviously very interesting for me as a privacy person, not just because of consent, but also because of data quality, right? Because we get a lot of garbage that just gets hoovered up from the internet. And there's an entire database, the AI incident database, that shows you what happens when we run fast and loose and we leave quality to the side and we're unscientific in how we create AI. So that executive order, actually, the wheels were already in motion for some time, and there were a lot of things that were already in place as a result of it. So one thing you may have noticed is all these federal departments and agencies, they had AI inventories where they had to tell you where they were using AI, how they were using it. And that's important for transparency with citizens. So they know, am I dealing with a human or am I dealing with AI, and how's it working? There were other things that happened on the procurement side. And then also importantly, prior to the executive order, they had come out with the AI Bill of Rights, which was about making sure that AI is designed to help us all, right? And so not designed to discriminate or to disfavor certain groups, making sure that it's robust and fair and that it respects our privacy, and privacy is all the way through it. So it layered over top of that, and it layered over other things and made for a really, really solid foundation. And it was a very sweeping, probably one of the most sweeping executive orders we've seen. So that was repealed. Now, recently, the Trump administration, or rescinded, sorry. So rescinded meaning the next president comes in, pulls it back and says, no, 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 we need to have unbridled innovation. I want to challenge that concept because I gave you the example of the AI incident database, and I wrote an article for Forbes actually on self-regulation. Doesn't work very well. We end up with a lot of data swamps and a lot of junk that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, but it can still do a lot of harm in the process. So what we saw with China, they didn't have access to the chips. They had a number of, to the highest level of Intel chips. They were facing a number of limitations due to restrictions on exports to China from the EU and from the US in particular under the CHIPS Act, but that didn't stop them from coming up with some faster and better technology. Now, OpenAI will tell you they just copied ours. Okay, maybe they did, but they did it faster and they used innovation. Necessity is the mother of invention. So when you have guardrails, it forces you to think creatively to surmount those guardrails, not rest on your laurels, right? And do those sorts of things. So what's happened since then is some people might push back on what you said about, oh, they're deregulating, and like, that's not exactly true. We have two recent examples where surprisingly, the Trump administration has done things that actually look like there's kind of a bit of a responsible AI flavor in there. There's a bit of a respect for data privacy. The two examples are this. One is there's a memorandum that the White House released recently, not the same thing as an executive order. So I don't think a memorandum, US lawyers can correct me on this, I don't think a memorandum is binding, but it is an expression of the White House's position on an issue, right? And so there's still, they do talk about innovation, but there's still quite a lot of responsible AI flavor in there. Not as robust, not as rigorous as what the executive order had. But one could look at that and say, well, if during Biden's administration, they were already putting those things in place, maybe now they won't dismantle them since this memorandum came out. That's one optimistic way to look at it. I'm often optimistic and cynical, and I'm going to give you my cynical take in a moment, but I want to talk about another one. There was a sweeping executive order that the Biden administration had put out as it was out the door. Going out the door. Well, sorry, actually it was back in March, but then the Department of Justice issued a rule, and that was to prevent the export or sale or transfer to certain countries, so adversarial countries, of sensitive personal information. This specifically dealt with personal information, full on a privacy thing. Sensitive personal information included de-identified information, location data, the kind of stuff that data brokers are just sucking up and sending everywhere, genomic data, biometric data. So all of these things, the location data is something, if you see any of you who develop apps, you want that data. Location data is incredibly valuable, but it's also incredibly revealing and sensitive as a result. Health data as well. So there are a number of things that under Biden, they had said, no, we can't be exporting them to those countries or to a company that has some kind of interest of, like China, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, I think. There was one more. So then there was the Department of Justice rule. They had put out the draft for consultation. It looks like Pam Bondi's Department of Justice pretty much ran with it. Like, didn't completely say, no, we're going to do, whatever. So first, Trump didn't rescind the order, interestingly, as far as I could see. And secondly, the Department of Justice went ahead and it was a final rule that they published. And so that actually puts a lot of restrictions on what can be sold. So one question that came up with the 23andMe bankruptcy, and as you know, I wrote a trilogy for Forbes on that, was could a foreign company buy it? And it looks like, well, yes and no. With this final rule in place, it couldn't be China, Russia, Iran, or Venezuela. And there's one, North Korea, I think is probably the other one. So in that case, because that rule is in place. But the question always arises is, how is a rule enforced? Now, what we've seen is with Doge, they've taken a chainsaw, as Musk liked to show, to all of these agencies, to their funding. Meanwhile, people are being fired and replaced and pushed out. So the FTC, which was the US, the big US watchdog enforcement arm, especially under the last administration, really went after big tech, really went after even smaller tech that was doing big harm. They sort of unlawfully pushed out all of the Democratic members of the FTC, and the new head of the FTC is actually said his focus is going to be on furthering Trump's anti-DEI agenda. So, and then I think they said something about competition. So there's certain things right now, a lot of the tech companies that were facing enforcement action that was underway are pushing for those to be forgotten or settled. And there have been some settlements, monetary settlements. They're not necessarily settling everyone. Now, the question becomes, if we were in an environment where it's just a different take on how you do regulation would be one thing. But what we've seen with Doge and everything else, which I'm sure we'll get into in more detail, is that this isn't about following the rules. It's not about following the Constitution and the normal constitutional order.
Right.
What that means is that selective prosecution is very, very possible and very, very likely. Okay. So in Project 2025, they had talked about selectively prosecuting certain companies on age verification to drive them out of business, like basically to impoverish them through all of the litigation from the FTC or whichever other agency was going to be involved, and ding them on age verification. So they were talking about porn sites. What they define as pornography is much broader than what you and I would necessarily think. It includes anything that doesn't involve heteronormative sexuality, right? So it doesn't have to be just saying trans is could be considered pornographic for them, right? So I've gone into a long thing. I hope I've answered that question, but that's what that means for an executive order, is that now we're in a situation where on the one hand, it looks like a lot of the guardrails are off, but on the other hand, we have arbitrariness. And so in any situation where the government is arbitrary and can be selective with their prosecution, you need to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. So if they're saying in theory that they care about the bulk export of sensitive personal information, you better not be anywhere close to even a whiff of looking like you are doing that thing. So there's some incentive to be more privacy preserving, more on top of your responsible AI. And then not to mention, just give me this one last piece. Remember, California had come out with their sweeping executive order on AI before Biden did. So shortly before Biden did. California is a massive economy. I think it's the world's fourth largest economy. So if you're building AI, you don't want to freeze yourself out of that. And then there are a number of other states in the US that have done that. And now we're looking at state AGs who are getting together to form coalitions to do coordinated enforcement activities. So effectively filling that deregulation gap with an enforcement arm that could have national impact.
There is the one thing I realize about the states, and you know this as well, is that a lot of the stuff, like, and this is something that Trump has argued for in a lot of ways. He wants to remove some of the, I guess, the control from federal, and say, no, let the states do that. It's up to them, right? So we see that when it comes to, let's say, data privacy laws, right? But then you talked about this memorandum. So like you said, you have to question whether or not it's enforceable. But then you look at another executive order that he signed, where he wants to remove the barriers. So he wants to remove the actual control over innovation, and wants to be able to win against China. So in some ways you say, well, how does that jive? How does that jive with what he's saying when it comes to certain protections that he will keep from the Biden administration?
So first of all, one thing I have to make very clear is that the executive orders only have impact federally and only on the federal public sector. right?
Okay.
On the executive branch of government. How it does affect the private sector is that we have complex supply chains. So even if you're not a bidder in a procurement, then you're not going to, maybe you're not directly bound by it, but down the chain, your product or your data set or whatever your innovation is going to be part of that AI service that's going to be pitched to a government buyer. You might disqualify them. So you lose that business as the small startup with the 10 people who are working hard coding and doing whatever, because you can't show where you got your data. You can't show that it's quality data. You can't show that you haven't been training it on the benchmark data, so now it knows all the answers, right? So that's how it affects that. But to get to your other question, first of all, Trump is not consistent, and he consistently lies. That's the only thing that's consistent about him.
True.
He is a toddler, and I'm just going to be unvarnished here. I'm already on a list. I can't go to the US, I'm sure.
Are you really? You're on a list?
I won't be traveling to the US. I won't be transiting through the US. I am absolutely on a list. It's easy to make these lists. Trump is a toddler who wouldn't pass the marshmallow test. He thinks from one transaction to the next. So to think that he has some big 4D chest, everything else, he's tanking not just stocks, but also bonds. Okay, so he's making China great again. He's making Russia great again, and he's turning the US into Russia. I know I don't want to alienate your listeners. I just want to be very clear. This is not the kind of certainty and stability you need in an economy. The reason why the move fast and break thing crowd was able to do what they were able to do was because intellectual property rights could be enforced in court, was because contracts were binding, and you could be sure if you had a contractual dispute, you could take it to a judge and they would listen to it dispassionately, because you could publish your research about an iOS bug and not be disappeared like Xiaofang Wang, who was the Associate Dean for Research at Indiana University's Luddy School of Informatics, Computers, and Engineering, IEEE member, someone who wrote on cybersecurity, data privacy, computer engineering, all the stuff that we love in the AI world, or that we have to be aware of in the AI world, has just been disappeared without any kind of explanation and erased from the website. So now you have people who are doing things that are innovative. You're saying you want to create an environment where, well, let's take down those guardrails, but guess what? There are other guardrails. And I will illustrate with an example. And this is in the biomedical field, but there's always AI in everything. So I'm sure there would be interest there as well. So there is a microscope, a new microscope that is being developed or has been developed. It's a massive breakthrough that could take us leaps and bounds ahead in terms of understanding how cancer works, diagnosing it, or whatever. So it could really help beat cancer is all you need to know. The person who helped invent that microscope, the postdoc, has been sitting in detention, in prison, for 2 months without trial, without anything. Why? Because she made a donation. And not a donation to anything that Trump, he's going after the Free Palestine folks. That's not what this was about. She's a Russian national who made a donation, who was known for her views opposing Russia's war in Ukraine. And so that shouldn't be someone who makes it onto Trump's enemies list. And frankly, Trump shouldn't have an enemies list if he's the leader of the free world, but there you have it. But she's been detained and is looking at possibly being deported to Russia, where another dual citizen, a Russian and American citizen, had been detained, had been given a 20-year life sentence for making a $51 donation to Razum for Ukraine, right? And was just released in a prisoner swap. Why am I telling you all of this? And you're probably thinking, why are we talking politics? Because you can't get away from it. She was doing important STEM research, incredibly important STEM research. And she's doing that in a country that is not supposed to be like Russia, where you can get arrested for putting up a piece of paper or making a donation because your neighbor snitched on you and there may or may not be any validity to it, or because you made too much money and now you're a competitor. In the United States of America, you're supposed to have constitutionally protected rights to freedom of expression. Well, she's been detained, and that research is, when the key researcher is no longer there, what happens to that research?
Yeah.
That's innovation that's being stifled for ideological reasons that have nothing to do with America's interests. Absolutely. That's supposed to be Russia's interests.
So, okay, so we're gonna kind of fast track into that topic now, because I feel like just simple things that we could probably bypass the whole idea of consent. Let's start with that first. Is it gone? Or is consent done? Because I mean, if there is this level of infiltration into, let's say, into U.S. data, at the government level, the IRS, etc., and DOJ is taking everything, and they're sharing it. There is actually this idea that we should share everything. Like, what really does that mean for an individual who knows that typically their information is always secure, is always safe when it's in the government's hands?
Okay, so as a starting point, because there are a few things in your question, there's the consent piece, which is a one-off transactional thing that you do.
Yes.
It's giving consent to a company. Let's talk about companies first, the private sector, then we'll get to the public sector. You don't really have the option to consent for many things with government. Like, I can't say, no, I don't feel like filing my taxes, so I'm not going to give you that data. So that's not even an option. But let's go to the private sector for a second and talk about consent. So when it comes to giving your consent, you're told a bunch of things and you're supposed to be informed. And if your consent isn't informed, you can't really say that you gave it. Even if you're informed in that moment in time that something's going to happen, they can change their policy on you, give you a big fat block of text. And if you have the time to read it and you even understand the implications of it, you should, in theory, be able to withdraw your consent if you no longer agree, like you're not going to agree to those terms. And consent should be granular enough that you're not forced to agree to an all or nothing, right? So a bunch of other things, like I can consent to give you my personal information for email marketing, but that doesn't mean you get to listen to everything I say and read all my emails and then use that to train your AI, right? Or maybe I'm okay with you using all my emails and my deepest, most intimate conversations to train your AI. Perhaps I am. So same thing with OpenAI is another good example, right? People consented to use it. They were told, we're not keeping all your chat histories. Like, you know, I haven't read their policies in detail, but I know that they have made a change that going forward, they are going to now keep those things. And they might even bring them up in a search. That's a very different experience. When you thought something was transitory and it was just going to be deleted and, you know, whatever, that's one thing. Now this thing remembering and maybe echoing it back to Hesse or to whoever else is using an OpenAI chatbot, that is a very different scenario. Did I consent to that? So when we rely on consent, I think it's actually a really problematic and asymmetrical and unfair approach to privacy. It looks really good because you're like, I don't give permission, but we have to say yes, 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 or no, 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 a million times a day, and you get consent fatigue. And also, we have an information asymmetry. I don't know what they're actually doing to protect it. Maybe they're third-party audited, maybe they're not, right? I don't know what's actually going on with that data that's being held. I don't know if they're going to be owned by somebody else. So nonprofits being purchased and turned into profit businesses. That happened with OpenAI. The Guardian is doing that with the Observer, right? So you never really know. You know very well, you and I have ranted many times. I think the consent regime puts the biggest onus for protecting privacy on the weakest possible player, the weakest and most vulnerable player. And we see that in the 23andMe. I talk about that in my articles. People just wanted to know maybe a bit about their ancestry, or maybe if they've got some weird condition and they were interested to know about that. But now that data is going to be purchased by sold in a bankruptcy as distressed assets. And yes, that ultimate acquirer is supposed to adhere to the privacy notice, but they can change the privacy notice anytime they want. Okay, yes, you can delete your data, but guess what? They don't delete it all, even if you delete your account. And maybe you didn't have an account, but your cousin did. Your data's still in there, but you don't have a way to delete it. So consent is problematic. Now, your question started with consent, but then you were talking about government and sharing. Do you want me to talk about that piece yet, or do you want to ask the question first?
I think part of the reason I moved from consent into government was everything that you brought up about what DOJ is doing. And when we think about privacy, we also think about security, and we think about consent at the government level. I totally agree with that. That's not something that you can say no to, but you do believe that if there's information that is about you, whether or not it's your tax filings or student loan, whoever holds that information, they're going to keep it as confidential and restrictive as possible, right? To only those who are allowed to see it.
And use it for the purposes for
And
which
use it
they
for the purposes.
collected it, not to create
Exactly.
a registry of people with autism.
Exactly. And so from that perspective, because the government has so much information of you and it's spread across, because it all depends on whether or not it's local or at the IRS or whether or not it's through like an institution, you know, um, how now do people expect their information, how vulnerable do people feel now that there's this transitioning to more sharing of information across government, and it also increases the risk to the, I guess, the security of how that information is actually being transmitted.
So to bridge the conversation we just had with this one, I just want to emphasize the fact that there's already so much data out there about us from the private sector and from the third sector, so like nonprofit, who didn't have the right guardrails in place or didn't understand that they were collecting more data than they should have. And it's all going to data brokers. It's all in all kinds of big data swamps. And there have been breaches, all kinds of breaches, public sector and private sector breaches, where our data has ended up on the dark web and you can buy it for very little money. So that's already out there. The reason why we like to keep data distinct, and the reason why we don't just talk about access and privacy is more than security, right? It's more than confidentiality. We talk about things like purpose limitation and data minimization. You can use it for this purpose and this purpose only. We separate it, and we have a need to know like you do in cybersecurity, but that need to know is not only, you know, for the purposes of doing your job, it's also to avoid you doing things with the data that you're not supposed to do, like inferring all kinds of things. So let's just take the IRS. Let's say the person who is in charge of having access to my historical filings, everything that I've had to give to the IRS to file my taxes. Think of all those things. I make donations. So I'm not American, but I have contributed to American nonprofits and charities with charitable status, and they have to file taxes, right? So this is why I say I'm on all kinds of lists, right? So I've made donations, I've bought from nonprofit newsrooms, I subscribe to them, I do all of these other things, and there was a situation where I did have to file a tax return one year in the US. So they may actually have my Canadian social insurance number. I can't remember. I had a separate number for them. So any individual who's an individual citizen has had to file, you could just take that data and use it the way it's supposed to do the tax filing, find out if you've paid your taxes, do you owe anything, done. Purpose limitation prohibits that tax officer, whoever the person is working there, from using that data to profile me, to match it with other information they can find on the internet and learn more about me, to deduce from my donations that I'm these political leanings or those political leanings, or I'm from this religion, or I have this health issue. They are not allowed to do that. And they know that. And they're also not allowed to give God access to anyone. So God access is where you get, like you said, you share. One person can access everything and see everything they need to see. Why is it that we do that? Why is it that we've gotten frustrated, especially after 9/11 in Canada and the US, that we're not sharing and privacy is the problem? It wasn't privacy that was the problem. There are ways for governments to share responsibly with one another, and they didn't act on the intelligence that was shared in 9/11, but nevertheless, those things are used as examples to say, let's break down these silos. We need all this data to be together because we don't want to live under the Gestapo. That's why we don't have them. We don't want them to have a dossier thicker than MI6 could ever dream in its wildest dreams of having, right? But now, because they're creating one API to serve them all, they're effectively turning all government data from NLRB, which is the National Labor and Research Board, so your union status, your employment, what you're doing, HHS, anything to do with healthcare, if you had Medicare, like if they start breaking down all of those silos, they have one big fat data lake, which they can use to then infer and learn all kinds of things about you. And then in addition to that, when they start doing that with AI, we can actually draw those inferences way faster than we ever could before. with our other technology, right?
Okay, so but can I stop you there? Because everything that you're saying, it seems right. But you said also they're not, like, for when we talk about purposeful limitation, government is not allowed to do that. But
No.
if government is the one that's allowing this data sharing, then what laws are preventing them from doing everything that
Yeah.
you said?
So there are plenty of laws that prevent them, including the Constitution, that prevent them from
Okay.
doing that. What's happening is they're not obeying it. The US is in a constitutional crisis. Some people are saying, are we there yet? No, it's not like you turn a switch on and off. It's been in a constitutional crisis, I think, and again, I'm not a constitutional scholar for the US, when Congress cut off its own powers, when the judiciary made him a king, they were already in the slow-moving train wreck towards constitutional crisis. So if you don't have the rules, now you're in a situation where you have not a dictator for a day, but a dictator who wants to stick around for a third and however many terms until he can pass it on to his daughter, right?
Okay.
So the rules, but before everyone gets depressed, the courts, particularly the lower courts, and even sometimes the Supreme Court of the US, SCOTUS, sometimes it actually has put its foot down. This is not, because the Trump administration has given up on the rule of law, is not a reason for individuals and groups to give up on the rule of law. And there have been tons of successful lawsuits. And so we saw in Voice of America, for example, their funding was taken away. They were supposed to be shut down. They've been reinstated. For the NLRB stuff, there have been a ton of lawsuits, and they're winning. And what's happening is in the polls, like, even the worst dictator knows they still need a certain part of the population to support them, to willingly be on side with them. So polling, like Putin polls his people, he watches polls voraciously because he knows there's a certain tipping point where even when you have all of this power and you have all of the police on your side and everything else, you could be like Assad and you could be tossed out at some point, right? Mm-hmm. So Trump, even with MAGA supporters, there's like, it's overwhelmingly unpopular for him to not be obeying court orders. So those lawsuits, you need to support them. So if you're concerned about it as an American citizen and you're concerned about your data, then you need to start donating to, the ACLU, who's bringing all of these lawsuits, and all of these other organizations. Mm-hmm. And you need to get out there and protest every which way you can, call your representative, and use citizen power to push against it. Because the only way to get them to follow the law is we need to be the enforcement now through public pressure. And that's actually working. There's been a lot of success. So I don't want people to be disheartened, but what it means is that you're going to have to keep on working and working. And if you think, oh, I'm not a political guy, I'm not even doing anything, I don't even tweet about anything, whatever, you see how it doesn't matter, right? Mm-hmm. At some point, you can get swept up. And if you aren't put on trial, you can never defend yourself. That's what due process is for. And that could come in the form of the FTC going after you over some little thing that actually really is a violation. So you didn't have the right age consent or whatever age gate on your mobile app, let's say, something that the FTC in the past could have gone after you, but they go after you specifically. And then they say, I want you to do me a favor though. Or on the flip side, and this is where I think tech companies need to really, really pay attention. After the Snowden leaks, there was a huge backlash and we were concerned about government overreach into our data. And that changed the direction for the EU. They were updating their data directive and it became the GDPR, which was sweeping and pervasive and revolutionary really in a lot of ways, I think, in terms of what it did to data protection. And that was because of the Snowden leaks and people reacting to something so nothing compared to what we have today, right? That was access to our email. Now, law enforcement access became a very hot button issue. Law enforcement is not supposed to be able to just go up to any company and say, hand over your data on this citizen, right? They should have some kind of legal basis for it. And sometimes it's justified in the context of an investigation. But what was happening was law enforcement was just going in and getting these back doors. And so what happened with the GDPR after the Snowden leaks was a lot of pressure was being put on tech companies to prove to us and to demonstrate to us that they would actually stand up and say, I'm not handing this over until you give me a valid warrant or you give me whatever, and stand strong. Now what we're seeing is not only are tech companies caving, we're seeing some of the 9 of the big law firms caving and capitulating. And so if they're too scared to enforce the rule of law in the face of something very clearly unconstitutional. How am I, as a little tech startup, supposed to say no to a law enforcement order? Well, one way you can do that is if you make it so that you're not collecting that data, or you can't unlock it either, right? So end-to-end encryption, edge computing, other things like that. So privacy enhancing technologies is going to reduce your data burden significantly. So that's one plus.
Mm-hmm.
And then as citizens, we need to be more careful about what it is. We need to scrub our own digital footprints, and there are tools out there that you can use for that as well. So, and then be a little, and pay attention and not be sharing, and use all those tools of digital self-defense and not share unnecessarily.
I think where it gets tricky, especially, or more scary for Canadians, is when, and you talked about this a little bit earlier, but especially when we go cross-border, right? And the whole idea of consent gets thrown out the door because they could ask to see your phone. And this is, I've heard from people who have said, oh no, that's just a media exaggerating exactly like how much powers are being given to much of the border security. But the reality is that I'm hearing from friends who have turned themselves away from the border because of the improper questioning that they're getting from these agents. And I mean, if people are using burner phones, that's real. I've heard 2 or 3 people have gone over.
Scientists are being encouraged to use burner phones because their science might upset dear leader if it uses a word like transgenic, which has nothing to do with gender. Right. So scientists are being encouraged to use burner phones. Any EU official that is traveling to the US is being told. That's what we used to tell people when they go to China.
Yeah.
So look, they can call our bluff. Like if they don't want to believe it, they don't have to believe it. But the fact is, a Canadian was detained for 2 weeks without charge, without anything, at the US border. She didn't get the opportunity to turn away. She didn't get the opportunity to choose not to go back. She was sent away by ICE. And there's a more nefarious piece to this. I want you to understand, Hessie. There is an entire, literally, prison industrial complex that's been built up around the promises that Trump was going to be rounding people up and detaining them. It's a great investment opportunity if you're somebody who, wants to build those things. And obviously, I'm not advocating it. Well, if you're building a prison, you need inventory. We are inventory. So there was a German citizen who was detained for 18 days. And people listening here who maybe they weren't turned off by the anti-DEI stuff and they don't see themselves as political, and maybe they're like, I'm just going to come right out and say it. They think they've got complexion protection. They're white men. They're not gay. They're not trans, whatever. Brian Krebs, as far as I can tell, is a white man. He was a Republican. He's a leading cybersecurity expert. The only thing that he did wrong was his job. They got rid of CISA. They got rid the very government officials who were doing the research into oh my gosh, what was that big one? It begins with an S. That Chinese hack. It began with an S, and I'm forgetting the name all of a sudden.
I don't remember.
Yeah, but anyway, it was a really, really big one. It went into telecoms. It was when they were saying everyone needs to use Signal instead of their regular messaging because our telecoms are compromised. It was that one. Why am I forgetting the name? That work was stopped. And just in case you were feeling like, okay, well, that's one thing, there's reporting from a whistleblower from inside, was it DHS? I can't remember. Not DHS, one of the government agencies that, no, I think it was the IRS. It was the IRS.
Oh, okay.
that there were, that this data that they're making available now is not just available to IRS employees, it's actually literally going to Russia through Starlink. So there's a back door. So there's all that data out there about you already. And now there's all this government data that was supposed to be protected and was, right? They had these strict rules. It was an old rule, the Privacy Act. It certainly needed an update, but people took it very seriously. They resigned rather than give God access. There were people who literally resigned. Like, would you just think about it? Your job, your pension on the line, all these things, you would be willing to step out. That's how firmly they believe in that.
Yeah.
And the kind of stuff that cybersecurity folks do in their training, that they do all the time, privacy folks do all the time. Because he did his job, he was subject to an executive order signed by the Sharpie of the President of the United States, supposed to be the strongest man in the world. He's making the US weak, so very soon he won't be. But he's supposed to be the leader of the free world, has put a target on a cybersecurity professional's head. Like he said, there is no daylight between tech and politics anymore. That's why Wired and 404 and all these other tech magazines are the ones breaking all these stories about Doge, the IRS, Trump 2.0, Project 2025, because there's no daylight. The oligarchy has intertwined itself inextricably, and not just through Musk, through Thiel with Palantir. They're leapfrogging procurement. So there are procurement rules. You're supposed to bid on contracts that are just being handed over to them without any competition, right? All the rules are out the window.
Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't help that also, like, some of the biggest publications are kind of falling in line as well.
Yeah, and they're refusing to cover. They're finally starting to cover the protests that have been huge all around the US. They're starting to cover them a bit. Even NPR at one point was groveling in a Senate hearing, like, oh, we should have covered Hunter Biden's laptop more. I mean, talk about weaponizing the justice system.
No, I know.
Right?
I mean, yeah.
So what does that mean for Canadians? There's physically crossing the border, but as you know, open up your phone. This is an American phone that I have, first of all, with an operating system. Apple already had to make concessions to the UK, which many people slammed. It was the advanced data protection feature that they had, where you could encrypt your iCloud on the back end. Keir Starmer, I don't know what's going on with him. He's decided he's going to I don't know. He's decided they wanted to have the encryption broken so they could have a backdoor, which is like keys under doormats are never safe for anyone.
Wow.
So Apple's concession to that was, we're going to just turn off the ADP feature so no one can encrypt their stuff in the cloud. We're not handing over our encryption, which at first I was really mad at them, but then when I understood that more nuanced argument, I was actually happy with it, because it means that ADP exists in other parts of the world. Right. But they could just as easily turn it off here in the US. Right. Yeah. And all those tech billionaires were on stage at the inauguration. The other thing is, any of the apps that you have in there, even if they're Canadian apps, chances are they're using a software development kit and they're giving permissions to a whole host of other players who are sending their data somewhere to some data swamp in the US, because they're designed for optimal sharing to support our surveillance economy, which is based on, I want to know as much as I possibly can about you, even more than you know about yourself, so that I can sell you stuff. Or target disinformation, but it started with that.
This is just more of an aside by anything about anything else, but I have a nephew who works as a car mechanic, and he was talking to me about the amount of data that's being stored, like, in your system. And it goes, as long as you connect to your Apple Car, Apple Connect, like, that information is automatically absorbed in your system and can go right to your provider, your car provider. So
yeah, I never connect my phone to any of those. I don't.
And unfortunately everybody does, right? That's the only way they can get their music. They can anyway. One thing I wanted you to talk about is the risk to Canadians, especially with the election coming up. We know that there are people who may be voting conservative. I don't want to talk about the politics here, but I do want to talk about some of the I'd say the data agreements that have been made between the US and the Canadian government, especially when it comes to data sharing of immigration, visa information. That was as early as this year. And it was made, like, the profiles of Canadian permanent residents that are made available to both the US and Canadian governments. This is even in advance of the Trump administrations coming into power. What does that mean, do you think?
So I can tell you a bit. So I was a public sector lawyer at one point, so I can tell you a bit about how that works under the Privacy Act and under other laws. So it is possible to have information sharing agreements with foreign governments. There's an exception to do that, provided certain safeguards are in place, certain measures. And you're not supposed to have those agreements with governments that don't have robust privacy protections, because if they're not going to adhere to those agreements, if you can't trust them to actually do what they say on paper, then you're putting your citizens or residents in your country at risk when you share data with them. We expect when we share with our Five Eyes partners that, you know, there are advantages to all of us to sharing, goes the explanation, right? That we're part of the Five Eyes. I think we're also part of the 14 Eyes, is that we can coordinate our responses when there are things like international terrorism or other threats to our national security. So there's a basis for that. We have agreements in place, and so you can only do what you're allowed to do, and we have to be careful what we decide to share, right? So even if you have an agreement in place. So in this case, provided all of those things are taken care of, you should feel comfortable sharing not on a pipeline basis, like you're just constantly sharing back and forth, but there have been other situations where and I don't know in this particular case if there's a common database, but you can share in a number of different ways, right? So the one way is you make a request and someone actually pulls up the file and then they securely share it with you. That's the hardest one because you have to make your case, and then there's a written request, and the government agency on the Canadian side has to produce that and report on that annually to Parliament. Annually, how many of these that they did. So that's how it works sort of under the Privacy Act. That assumes that you're dealing with a good faith partner who is like-minded and aligned with you and your cultural values. So other democracies, you wouldn't see us having an agreement like this with North Korea, right? So, but now the US is not that partner anymore. We've already had candidates say that, including Mark Carney, who is our current prime minister, say flat out that the US is a national security risk. So if that's the case, can we really be sharing that data? We have to really question whether it's safe or appropriate to do that. I don't know the circumstances, right? Like if this is in a very specific case where we're trying to catch, or they're trying to catch a child sexual predator and they've done their due diligence and they have a case, then maybe there's a justification. But a willy-nilly sharing, when especially there are accuracy issues, and right now the problem with the US is there's no due process. So before we thought we could rely on there being some kind of due process. What does that mean? I accuse you of something, I tell you what that is, you can say, well, where's the evidence? You can show your evidence to rebut it. You know, that's due process, right? So people can't just say whatever they want and then send you to El Salvador. The problem is right now the Trump administration can say whatever they want and send you to El Salvador, and they can even admit in a court filing, like they did with Kilmer Abrego Garcia, that we got it wrong, but sorry, we can't bring him back.
Yeah.
So he's now in a torture prison where the president of El Salvador has said the only way out is in a coffin. Right? And that was based on erroneous information. Now, there's a Canadian connection here, going back to the early aughts, so shortly after 9/11, where our RCMP shared inaccurate information. It was intel with the US to assist them. And what they ended up doing was they took a Canadian citizen who was also a Syrian citizen. They intercepted him in transit in a third country. I can't even remember which country it was. And they didn't send him back to Canada. They sent him to Syria, where he was tortured for months. We had an entire inquiry into this. So there are two things there. One, we really messed up because we should never have shared faulty intelligence. We never should have shared. So the accuracy principles, when we talk about in privacy, it's really having its day in the sun right now, I have to say, with all these examples. But two, we assumed that the US was going to abide by its own constitution when we sent that. So the risk of inaccurate information, it's still a risk because you put someone through a horrible situation that they shouldn't be through, but they can defend themselves. But at least, you know, but it's that much greater when someone doesn't even know what the charge is. They don't even know where they're going and they're sent to some black site. That literally happened before the US was in a constitutional crisis, before we had Trump dictator for a day. That was under George W. Bush.
Right.
So we really do have to ask ourselves if we're comfortable. And I want to bring in another Canadian connection, and this is a procurement one, and it might sound boring and whatever, but if you're in tech or in business and you want to, or if you're a citizen or a resident of Canada, Palantir is on our pre-qualified suppliers list. That's the firm, that's Peter Thiel's firm. That's the firm that right now has the ICE contracts to make it easier to identify people of certain political opinions, to find targets for deportation, not necessarily to their home country either. That's what Peter Thiel is doing.
And for people who don't know who Peter Thiel is, ex PayPal, now I'm not sure if he's now chairman of Palantir. He owns Palantir, but and also one of the, I guess, the original influencers or authors within Project 2025. I believe.
No, not an author. Very aligned. So Project 2025 is the Heritage Foundation, and they have their own ideological objectives. And Palantir and the sort of the broligarchy, so the Elon Musks and the Peter Thiels and that gang, the white South African billionaire
Right.
migrants, they have a vision of the future where we replace democracy with technology, a technocracy, where you have and they're already advertising network states in other or network cities or network states in other parts of the world. I think Ecuador was one of the countries where it's basically they take over a piece of land and they turn it into something that's effectively run by a CEO, and they can do whatever they want. And so he is a fan of this other guy, Peter Yarvin, who said, we need to get over our dictator phobia. Basically, you need a few very, very smart people to run us with technology. So we don't need to have a will. We can just be run with technology. That's the guy who's helping to create ICE target lists. And he's on our pre-qualified supplier list. And the RCMP did buy some kit from him years ago. There was a contract that they were awarded. So once you're pre-qualified, it makes it easier for you to win other procurements. Anna Brandusescu, she's got her PhD finally, I think, or she was a PhD candidate, but she's done a lot on AI and how AI is used sometimes against citizens. She talks about national security, all of those things. So she was calling this out years ago about Palantir being on our pre-qualified list, and how it's called the suppliers list or something like that. It just makes it easier to contract, and you don't necessarily have to go to market every time.
Right.
For certain, but you can actually just hand a contract over. And that's not even necessarily going to be that transparent until it's already done.
Interesting.
So we, as Canadians, absolutely need to nip this in the bud. And then finally, we have our own broligarchy that's really pushing for, who they're rooting for. I think I know who they're rooting for, but they want to see a Doge for Canada. They want to see they haven't read Putin's People, so they don't understand that means that their time on this world is limited.
Absolutely.
Because all the oligarchs who propped up Putin, the industrialists who propped up Hitler, they didn't last very long. They use you until they don't need you anymore. You see how Musk has destroyed his business and he's out in the cold right now. And he was president. So, but anyway, there is, and the person who talks about that a lot, who's done a really good job with that, is Rachel Gilmore. So I have some links I can share with you.
That would be great if we could share it later on.
Yeah.
Oh my God, there's so much more that we can talk about, because I do want to get very quickly before we wrap up into this idea of erasure and data suppression and everything that we're seeing right now in the U.S. and the critical data, especially those that have any kind of historical significance, that has been erased either from their website or even just through the suppression of research, even January 6th Capitol attacks removed, right? Those kinds of things. Even when it comes to like the loss of the CDC vaccine guidelines or HIV, any kind of critical reason.
Weather forecast.
Oh my gosh, that's been so.
The definition of water is changing. The definition of day is changing to bend to ideology. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and is that what it is though? Is it redefining a new order based on an ideology, so that if you erase all this stuff, it's almost like it never existed in the first place?
I think a lot of us read 1984 in high school as a cautionary tale, not as a manual. The thought police and thought crimes and all of that stuff, and words not double think and all of those things, that's what that is, right? So if you frame a narrative, people make decisions. And again, this is why I say disinformation and manipulation are very much privacy issues, because it impacts your decisional privacy, right? So that's why disinformation is an area I'm very interested in. what you do is you shape a certain narrative. And so if all you've ever heard about science or whatever, you've heard the sun revolves around the earth, and it only revolves around the earth, and no, and God says the sun revolves, and everyone says so. And now you have a scientist who says, I've done the research, and look, the dominant orthodoxy has been disproven by my research, or at least my research cast doubt on it. I think it's the other way around. I think the earth revolves around the sun. That scientist gets killed. And that happened. And that we saw that with other scientists historically. And we look back and we say, wow, like, you know, the dark ages and whatever. That's what happened, though, is it was ideology and authority trumps evidence and science. And so why do we do that? Why do we do that? Why do we erase the achievements of the code talkers or the people who have built things like gas masks, or who defended us and defended the US valiantly in World War II? Because you want to frame a certain narrative, and that person then becomes a counter evidence to the story you want to tell. In this case, this whole anti-DEI thing is really, they want to tell a story of white supremacy, that only white men, and only certain white men, you know, heterosexual, there is no trans anyway, that doesn't even exist, right? Only those people ever did anything of value. And so only those people will get appointed to my cabinet, even though they're far less qualified than the previous guy who didn't have the same complexion. And we see that now with Signalgate, what a disaster that is. Mm-hmm. And we see with the American economy tanking and the stock market and bonds tanking, that the Nepo baby hires, the sycophant hires, the white supremacy hires, they're not all that great for the economy, right? I'll take a DEI hire, and I don't even want to use that term because it discredits the actual value. But the people that they would call DEI hires are the ones who had to be twice as good for half the pay and half the attention. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who always have to prove themselves and can't say, oops, I let Ebola run wild for a minute.
Absolutely. Like Musk. But we have to also like acknowledge that when we talk about DEI, it's also you know, diversification of thought. It also talks about mm-hmm. like veterans, you know, it talks about people who
accessibility. Yeah, all the veterans, right? Programs, that's DEI. Yeah,
absolutely. So just one last thing, because all of this is going on right now, and the amount of latitude that's given to big tech, and the amount of dismantling the administration's doing, it's going to be hard to bring a lot of this back. Let's say if there was a change in administration, but do you think we can somehow reverse the effects of this if somehow people wised up, and hopefully before the next election that there are going to be changes to try to reverse some of the effects of this?
So I think there are a lot of things, and I'll talk about how tech plays a role, but there are, so autocracies they look stable, but they're not. Strong men are actually very, very weak of heart and very fragile. And so when people push back, like Harvard did, as opposed to Columbia, they say sorry. The US administration actually said, sorry, that was a mistake. They're still suing them. Harvard is still suing them. Columbia was threatened, even though they had a big, fat endowment, so they didn't even need the US money. They had their rainy day endowment. They said, okay, we'll do all of these things. We'll help you disappear Mahmoud Khalil. We'll help you do all these things. Yeah. And we'll get rid of our DEI, and we'll do all of this. They still haven't gotten their money, but they certainly don't have the respect of anyone anymore. And so when you give in to a bully, the bully just keeps taking, like a Leviathan. So I think for you in the tech world, if you think, well, I'm just going to go along to get along, you are never going to get along. You're just delaying the inevitable, and the inevitable might come sooner than you expect, like it did with Xiaofeng Wang, who I don't even know if he published anything controversial. And if they say he was a spy, or they said whatever, there's a whole process for that. There's actually laws that are pretty favorable to the government for that. There's the FISA court. There's all this other stuff they could have done, and they didn't. So you're not helping yourself or anyone. The chaos right now in the US economy even has some of the most conservative voices like the Wall Street Journal using the I word. They're talking about impeachment because he's tanking the economy. You have people talking about resistance who were like, oh, there'll be a bit of pain, you know, whatever, we'll cut these programs, there'll be a bit of pain, inflation, whatever, deal with it. They're now saying, so like if even these people who they're absolutely not radicals, they're not left wing, they're not all about equality and human rights, they're just about their pocketbooks, they realize that this is not good for them. It's not going to be good for tech, because what's happening right now is they're deregulating everything. So you go to a conference, don't drink the milk, because the FDA is not going to be checking it for chalk or asbestos anymore, which is what they used to always put in. In the privacy world, we would always talk about how you need to regulate social media and tech. We need to make sure we know we're not just being told what data they're taking, but what they are actually taking, what they're doing. And we used to say, you know, the food industry used to not be regulated, and they would put all kinds of garbage and people would get sick and you could never be sure if you were eating actual potatoes or you were eating something else. And so they brought regulation. We need to do the same thing for us for technology and for data privacy. Now it's like data privacy actually maybe arguably has better protection than our food, than our air.
Absolutely.
I'm not kidding, Hessie. They changed the definition of water so they don't have to protect certain bodies of water from toxic chemicals and sewage being dumped into it. So how well are your employees going to be able to code when they've got dysentery? Or they're dying from the measles? Or they're on a registry of autistic people, which, by the way, I'm going to be doing a talk on neurodiversity. I just got diagnosed with ADHD, and it explains a whole lot. And I love my brain. I hate it sometimes, but I love it as well. And there are plenty of autistic people who've done amazing stuff. And the way RFK talks about them, it turns my stomach. It makes me so angry. Not because I'm also neurodiverse or whatever, but because even if I weren't, it's not even true. It's the language of eugenics. And you can see they're picking off all their different little groups that they want to. They started with trans folks because it's not well understood. So even people in the LGBT community or LGBT community, some of them wanted to distance themselves. Well, I'm gay, but I'm not trans. You know, if they can pick as many people off, you let your values go, right? And so, and then now what they're doing with all of this deregulation is you can't even be sure that, you know, like, when they tank the US dollar and they want to replace it with crypto, don't think that means your crypto is going to be safe. It means they're taking the treasury and everything else. So what does that mean for people in tech? It means don't go along to get along. It means now is the time to resist, because the longer you go and the worse it gets, the harder the resistance becomes. So now is the time. South Korea, they saw one authoritarian move by their guy and he was out.
I know.
He said that took a long time, and that was only 3 months. Because you know why? Because they lived under dictatorship. There's a movie on it. I'm going to watch it soon called 1997. Talks about how they did it. So there's a book called From Dictatorship to Democracy that talks about how democracies can arise out of dictatorships and what people do. Absolutely. We don't want to have to get to the point of being in that full dictatorship. Canada is at risk if we let our own values, if we go the way that the US is going. That's why we need to stick to our values. We have those values for a reason. We didn't follow the US into Iraq. We didn't follow them into the subprime market crisis. And we certainly don't need to follow them into this Doge business. It's not about efficiency. It's about surveillance. Yeah.
Is that a political statement ahead of our US, ahead of our Canadian elections?
I think everything I've said is a political statement, because politics is indistinguishable from us right now. And like I said, but in terms of a partisan statement, I think Pierre Poilievre is a real threat. I think he is dangerous. And I know people say, oh, Maple MAGA, whatever, that's an exaggeration. There are amazing mashups. If you follow Greenpeace Canada on Blue Sky, you'll see they've got these amazing mashups. The language is very similar. The same people endorsing Trump are endorsing him. But that is not just their endorsements. Pierre Poilievre doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have a record. He doesn't have any accomplishments under his belt for his 20 years, but he draws a really fat pension. He's saying that now I have to wait until I'm 67 to draw mine, but he could draw his at 65 and actually started getting one at 31. So the kids never worked anywhere else. But a lot of there is kind of a oligarchy in Canada that Rachel Gilmore has exposed that's very keen on him. They've created, I think, the Canadian Centre for Innovation. Shopify's CEO apparently is all on board. His spouse or somebody related to him runs a disinformation dubious right-wing paper that has been called disinformation. I haven't read it, so I can't say, called True North or something like that.
Yes.
Rebel News is a paid advertiser. They're registered as an advertiser, masquerades as news, and it keeps disrupting the pressers. Dean Blundell did a really good expose on that. So I have links to share that you can share with your audience. But yeah, I don't love Carney, but at the same time, I think at least he believes in our core
the
values.
least to the worst, I guess. You know,
Vote for the least
devil
worst.
you know, right?
Vote for the least worst. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, you vote in your riding for your MP, and so vote for the MP. But I don't want to see. I want to see Pierre Poilievre lose his seat.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to volunteer for Bruce Vanjoy's campaign. I never thought I'd ever volunteer for a Liberal. I can't even remember the last time I voted Liberal. I'm not a big fan of the party. Just to put that out there. Absolutely. I'm actually going to be volunteering for the Liberal candidate. He's actually a really great candidate. He's got a renewable home that he built himself. He worked for Habitat for Humanity. He actually builds houses. Pierre talks about building houses. He actually
he only built 6 or something like that.
And he shows up in his community. So I'm going to be, yeah. I mean, you can cut this part. Great. Maybe your audience is interested in it.
I have to say, as we wrap up, like, thank you like so much for, I mean, a lot of the information that you provided today. You know, I didn't realize like there's so many elements to how data impacts everything. And today it does impacts every facet of our lives, just because everything around us, in our personal, in our work, in what we wear, in who we talk to, in our cars, whatever, it can be used against us. It can be weaponized. And I think that's the real world that we thought was dystopia, but it's what we live in right now. So, yeah, I don't like that word either. But anyway, I thank you, Abigail, for coming to talk to us today. It's important to talk a lot about stuff like this, especially now, because we are in a time of retrenchment. There's a lot of uncertainty out there. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of shock at what's happened. And I think the real concern is it going to make it across our borders? And I think we'll start to see that probably next week. Election April 28th. Go out and vote. And
and just can I just mention a little pre-bunking ahead of time? We have a number of foreign actors that are interested in casting doubt on the validity of our election, and they're going to want to see doubt for any side, right? They don't necessarily have to favor one party over another. The thing is, if you can, one of the ways that disinformation can work really well is you just destabilize people, and they don't believe in facts anymore, and they don't believe in truth, and you can polarize them. So you can send. So we saw that with Musk during the campaign. They were sending targeted messages to Jews and targeted messages to people who they believe supported Palestine, free Palestine, so opposed the war in Gaza. And they sent entirely different messages about the same candidate because they were hyper targeted. So you don't need to necessarily. So the pre-bunking I want to do is that a couple things. One is we had record turnout, and I'm so happy about it to see Canadians so engaged. I think something like 7 million voted in advance. Right. I'm one of them.
Me too.
The problem is a lot of us were away. We were outside of our ridings. So in my case, I had to vote by special ballot. So that gets counted a bit differently. So I didn't have my thing printed with my candidate that I could just tick. So that's going to cause some delays in getting our final numbers. In the riding that Pierre Poilievre is in, there's a ridiculous initiative. I'm so mad at these people. Like, I don't like our first past the post system, but there are many ways you can make an impact and convey that message, but they did it stupidly. They have this longest ballot initiative. There are 91 independent candidates riding in that riding, in addition to the Conservative, which is Pierre Poilievre. You've got the Liberal, which is Bruce Vanjoy, and then you have an NDP candidate, a Green candidate, a few other small parties, and then you have all these independents. So it's the longest ballot. It takes forever to get fed through the machine. They had to fold it specially. So what does that mean? Why am I telling you about that? In the time where we're not getting results, or where things are looking close, or anything else happens, people are going to seize on this longest ballot thing and say it was interference. They're going to seize on the fact that we haven't, the numbers showed one thing, and then suddenly maybe there was a swing by the people who voted in advance. So they had the red mirage thing they talked about in the US. I don't know how it's going to fall in Canada. But in those delays, be prepared. It's going to come, I think. It'll come internally. Rebel News is definitely going to do something about it on the side of Pierre Poilievre, for sure. And so will True North and maybe a few others. But what's going to happen is you're going to have, there's going to be Russia, China, India, for sure. You're going to see some hashtags out of India, and probably even Israel, because Mark Carney's upset Israel by acknowledging possibly, maybe, but he's backtracked on it, that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide. So there, we're going to have at least those 4 countries interfering, and then the US, absolutely. That massive media machine, the Dan Bonginos, we already had people here in Canada who were on the RT payroll, right? So we are going to see that. It might be Trump, it might be Musk. If it's not Musk saying it out loud because he's shied away from politics, he's financing campaigns that are doing that. So we need to have our spidey senses on. We need to trust we have a good system here. We need to trust it, and we need to, if there are legitimate reasons to doubt that there were maybe mistakes, then we need to investigate that in a proper way and not start speculating if our candidate doesn't win.
Absolutely.
So please, Canadians, keep your head on straight. Do not get swept up in the disinformation tsunami that's going to hit us with this election.
My goodness. Thank you. Thank you for that. All right. So that's all we have for today. Thank you so much, Abigail. For audience, if you have topics that you want us to explore, please email us at communications@altitudeaccelerator.ca. TAC Uncensored. It's powered and produced by Altitude Accelerator. We're hosted on Spotify. You can find us wherever you get your podcast. And for this episode, my name is Tetsi Jones. Please stay curious and please be inspired.